By the time the elevator reached the 42nd floor, Mara Ellington had already decided she would not cry. The soft hum of the lift vibrated through the soles of her shoes, steady and mechanical, nothing like the erratic pounding in her chest. Glass walls revealed the city unfolding beneath her, steel, glass, ambition stacked upon ambition. It was the kind of view people worked their entire lives to earn. It was the kind of view Nalin Crest owned. She exhaled slowly, tasting the faint bitterness of stale coffee on her tongue. The morning had begun like any other. A rushed commute, unread emails piling up, a half-finished thought about quitting her job and disappearing somewhere warm. She hadn't known then that today would end with an ultimatum delivered by one of the most powerful men in the tech world. And the man she had once loved. The elevator chimed. Mara lifted her chin as the doors slid open. Crest Innovations' executive floor stretched before her, minimalist, hushed, intimidating in its deliberate restraint. Pale wood floors. Abstract art that probably cost more than her annual salary. A receptionist who looked up with a carefully neutral expression, as if she'd already been warned. "He's expecting you," the woman said. Of course he is, Mara thought. She walked down the corridor, heels clicking too loudly in the silence. With every step, memories pressed in uninvited. Late nights debugging side by side, greasy takeout eaten over laptops, Nalin's rare, crooked smile when something finally worked. Back when Crest Innovations had been nothing more than a risky idea and a cluttered apartment. Back when they had been equals. The double doors to Nalin's office stood open. He was already inside, standing near the windows, hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying conquered territory. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, tall, precise, composed. The same dark hair, now flecked with silver at the temples. The same sharp focus in his eyes, honed by years of command. He turned when he heard her. Mara. Her name sounded different in his mouth now, polished, controlled. "You wanted to see me," she said, refusing to fill the space with small talk. Nalin gestured toward the seating area but didn't sit himself. He remained standing, as if already braced for impact. "I'll get straight to the point." That at least hadn't changed. Mara folded her arms loosely, more to anchor herself than to appear defensive. "Good. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. A flicker of something, irritation perhaps, crossed his face before it vanished. He took a breath, slow and deliberate. "I'm getting married." The words landed with a dull thud rather than the explosion she'd expected. She had known this was coming. The tabloids had speculated for months. A man like Nalin Crest didn't stay single forever, not when his life was measured in headlines and shareholder confidence. She nodded once, "Congratulations." There it was, polite, distant, perfectly acceptable. But Nalin didn't relax. If anything, his shoulders stiffened further. "There's more," he said. "Of course there is. I need you to be the bride." The room seemed to tilt, just slightly, as if the building itself had taken a cautious step back. Myra blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" He turned fully toward her now, eyes locking onto hers with the same intensity he used in boardrooms and crisis meetings. "I need to marry you, or," he paused, jaw tightening, "or I'll marry my ex." The silence that followed was absolute. Mara felt something inside her go very still. She waited for the punchline, the smirk, The admission that this was some elaborate test, some twisted joke, none came. Nolan stood there, deadly serious, as though he were discussing a merger or a hostile takeover. "You're giving me a choice," she said slowly. "Yes." Her laugh escaped before she could stop it, short, sharp, incredulous. "Between you and your ex." "Between stability and disaster," he corrected. "Between a future that works and one that will implode." She dropped her arms, suddenly too tired to hold herself together. "Do you hear yourself?" "This isn't personal," Nolan said too quickly. "It's strategic." That hurt more than she expected. He began to pace, the movement precise, controlled. "You know the situation. The board wants a public commitment. Investors want reassurance. Aurora Vale," he didn't say the name easily, "has influence. Ties that could complicate everything if she's back in my life." "And marrying me fixes that," Mara said flatly. "Yes." Because she was safe, unthreatening, controllable. Because she knew his world and wouldn't embarrass him in it. Because she had already loved him once and survived the fallout. Because she mattered, just not in the way she once hoped. Mara studied his face, searching for cracks. "And what do I get out of this?" His packing stopped. "Anything you want." The words echoed, hollow and heavy. "Anything." She thought of the years she'd spent building his dream while quietly shrinking her own. Of the breakup that had been framed as mutual but felt like abandonment. Of the way he'd walked away to chase scale and success, leaving her behind with half-finished code and unanswered questions. The city shimmered outside the windows, oblivious. She felt strangely calm. "Well," she said, tilting her head slightly, "when you put it like that." Nolan's eyes sharpened. Hope or relief flickered there just for a second. She smiled. "Fine." The tension in the room released in a single breath. Nolan straightened, already shifting into logistics, into planning, into control. "Good, then we'll." "But," Mara continued gently, her smile never wavering, "before you start rearranging my life like a line item on your balance sheet, there's something you should know." He frowned. "What is it?" She took a step closer, close enough that he could see the certainty in her eyes. "I'm not who you think I am anymore." The words landed softly. And somewhere, deep beneath the polished floors of Crest Innovations, the future began to crack. Mara turned toward the door, leaving Nolan staring after her, the city's reflection swallowing his own. As she walked out, one question lingered unspoken in the air. How well can you ever really know someone you once loved? And what happens when the version you remember no longer exists? Mara Ellington didn't stop smiling until the elevator doors closed behind her. The moment the polished steel reflected her face, the expression slipped, not into grief, not into anger, something quieter, sharper, like a blade finally unsheathed after years in its scabbard. She leaned back against the wall as the elevator descended, the soft whoosh of controlled motion matching the calm she'd forced into place. Her heartbeat slowed, each thud deliberate. She had surprised him. That alone felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself she'd thought permanently surrendered. People always assumed she was predictable. That was the mistake. The lobby of Crest Innovations was already buzzing when she stepped out. Engineers clustered around standing desks, a tour group trailing a junior exec, the faint scent of citrus cleaner mixing with espresso. This building ran on momentum, on certainty, on the idea that everything here was intentional. Mara threaded through it all, head high, posture composed. No one stopped her. No one suspected that a life-altering proposition had just been dropped like a live wire into her lap. Outside, the city air hit her with a rush of cold. She inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the sound of traffic, the rhythm of footsteps, the ordinary chaos of people living their lives without ultimatums hanging over them. Marry me or my ex. She almost laughed again. Aurora Vale. The name alone carried weight. Nolan's former fiancée, his opposite and his mirror. Brilliant, ruthless, media-savvy in a way Mara had never bothered to be. Aurora didn't build things quietly. She announced them, branded them, claimed them. And once, years ago, she had claimed Nolan. Mara crossed the street and ducked into a small cafe she'd frequented since, before Crest Innovations had security badges and marble floors. The barista recognized her immediately. "Same as usual?" he asked. "Yes," Mara said, grateful for the normalcy. She took her coffee to the corner table by the window, wrapping her hands around the cup as if drawing warmth from more than the heat. The question Nolan hadn't asked, couldn't ask, pressed at her thoughts. Why her? It wasn't just familiarity or convenience. Nolan Crest didn't make billion-dollar decisions on sentiment. If he was willing to risk bringing her back into his life at this scale, it meant something else was at play. Mara had learned long ago that when Nolan said strategic, he meant afraid. Her phone buzzed. A text from her younger brother, Theo. "Did you survive the dragon's lair?" She huffed a soft breath and typed back. "Barely, we'll explain later." Theo had been the one to pick up the pieces after the breakup, the one who watched her sleep on his couch, replaying conversations she'd never get to finish. He knew Nolan only as the man who had left, not the myth the world worshipped. The cafe door opened, letting in a gust of wind and Lena Park. Myra froze. Lena spotted her immediately and broke into a grin. "I thought that was you." Lena Park was many things. A gifted product designer, a brutally honest friend, and one of the few people who had seen both the rise of Crest Innovations and the implosion of Mara's relationship with its founder. "You look like someone just offered you a deal with the devil," Lena said, sliding into the chair across from her. Mara didn't bother deflecting. "Close." Lena studied her face, the way she always did when she sensed a story beneath the surface. What did Nolan want? There it was. The name still carried electricity. Mara stirred her coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. "He wants me to marry him." Lena's eyebrows shot up. "I'm sorry, he what?" "And if I say no," Mara added calmly, "he marries Aurora Vale." Silence. Then Lena leaned back slowly, crossing her arms. "Okay, first of all, that's unhinged. Second, why you?" Mara met her gaze. "That's the question, isn't it?" Lena didn't answer immediately. She worked close enough to the executive floor to know how power really moved. "This isn't about love," she said finally. "No. But it's not just PR either," Lena continued. "Aurora scares him." "Yes," Mara said softly. "And you don't." There it was, the truth laid bare. Mara should have felt insulted. Instead, she felt free. She had spent years being the steady one, the quiet genius, the woman who made the impossible work without demanding applause, Being underestimated had once hurt. Now it felt like leverage. "Are you going to do it?" Lena asked. Mara stared out the window at the stream of pedestrians, each one moving with a certainty she envied. "I told him fine." Lena's mouth fell open. "Mara." "I'm not done," Mara said. "I didn't say yes, I said fine." Lena narrowed her eyes. "That smile you had just now, that's dangerous." Mara smiled again, just a little. "He thinks this is about saving himself." "And it's not." Mara thought of the nights she'd stayed awake rewriting code that bore someone else's name, of the way her career had stalled while his exploded, of the ideas she'd shelved because there hadn't been room for two visionaries in one orbit. "It's about balance," she said, "and truth." Lena leaned forward. "You're planning something." "I'm considering my options." Which was another way of saying she was done being reactive. Across the city, in an office that suddenly felt too quiet, Nolan Crest stood exactly where she'd left him. The city still glittered. The board meeting still loomed. The certainty he'd built his empire on had a hairline fracture running straight through it. Mara Ellington had agreed too easily. That realization settled into his chest with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He replayed the moment, the smile, the calm, the words, "I'm not who you think I am anymore." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. And Nolan Crest had built his life on understanding systems. People, he was realizing, were far more volatile. As he turned back to his desk, a single thought followed him, unwelcome and insistent. When someone you once loved stops needing you, what do they become instead? And more importantly, what do they see when they finally look at you clearly? The boardroom at Crest Innovations had been designed to inspire confidence. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a seamless oval table, screens embedded so cleanly into the walls they seemed to breathe data rather than display it. Nolan Crest stood at the head of it, hands resting lightly on the glass surface, listening as numbers rolled past him like distant thunder. "Market volatility tied to leadership perception," one director said. "It's not fatal, but it's sensitive." Sensitive, that was the polite word for fragile. Nolan nodded, eyes fixed on the skyline beyond the windows. He had anticipated this. He always did. What he hadn't anticipated was how thin his margin for error had become. "And Aurora Vale?" another voice asked. The room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. "She has reached out," Nolan said evenly, "unofficially." A murmur followed. Aurora was a known quantity, brilliant, polarizing, the kind of woman whose presence doubled valuations or halved them depending on the room. "She wants back in," the chairwoman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And—" Nolan turned from the window. "That will not be happening." The chairwoman regarded him carefully. "Because of Mara Ellington." The name hung in the air, unexpected and destabilizing. Nolan didn't answer right away. He thought of Mara's smile, of the calm in her eyes, of how easily she'd agreed too easily. "I have a solution," he said finally. "One that ensures continuity without introducing volatility." The chairwoman studied him. "We'll need details soon." Soon, everything was suddenly soon. As the meeting adjourned, Nolan's phone vibrated. A message from Aurora. "We should talk. You know this ends better if we're on the same side." He didn't reply. Instead, he opened a different contact, Mara Ellington. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Dinner tonight. We need to discuss terms. The response came faster than he expected. Tomorrow, and we'll discuss mine first. Nolan stared at the screen longer than necessary. Across town, Mara ended the call with her former manager and leaned back in her chair, pulse steady. Saying fine had shifted something. Saying my terms had cemented it. She hadn't told Nolan everything, not yet. Some truths were better delivered face to face. That evening, as she packed up to leave her office, a smaller, quieter space far from Crest's glass towers, her phone rang again. This time, the name made her jaw tighten. Aurora Vale. She let it ring once, twice. Then she answered. Hello, Aurora. A pause, then a smooth, amused voice. Still direct. I always admired that about you. What do you want? Mara asked. To congratulate you, Aurora said lightly, if the rumors are true. Mara's lips curved. Funny, I was about to say the same to you. Silence stretched, charged. So he gave you the choice, Aurora said. Classic Nolan. He did. And you said yes. I said fine. Aurora laughed softly. Careful, that's how you end up married to him. Or how you end up learning who he really is, Mara replied. Another pause, this one sharper. Be careful, Mara, Aurora said. Nolan doesn't like surprises. Mara's voice didn't waver. Neither do I. When the call ended, she stood for a moment, phone still in hand. The game had begun sooner than she'd expected. And she wasn't the only one playing. Somewhere between ambition and memory, Nolan Crest was about to learn what happened when leverage changed hands. Dinner the next night took place somewhere deliberately neutral, a private room in a quiet restaurant overlooking the river. No paparazzi, no executives, just two people pretending they weren't rewriting each other's futures. Mara arrived first. She chose her seat carefully, back to the wall view of the door. Old habits, useful ones. When Nolan walked in, he paused just briefly as if recalibrating. She looked different. Not in the obvious ways. Her hair was the same dark wave, her posture the same composed line. But there was an ease to her now that unsettled him. You look well, he said. So do you, she replied, which was true. Power suited him. That didn't mean it was kind. They ordered without ceremony. Silence settled between them, not awkward, just loaded. You said you had terms, Nolan said at last. Yes. She folded her hands on the table. This won't be a performance marriage. No staged affection. No pretending I'm an accessory. He nodded, agreed. I remain independent, professionally and financially. Of course. And she added, eyes steady, if this becomes damaging to either of us, I walk. No retaliation. That gave him pause. You don't trust me. I trust incentives, Mara said gently. They're more reliable. He studied her, something like admiration flickering through his control. Anything else? Yes, she leaned forward slightly. You don't get to control the narrative alone. Nolan's jaw tightened. Media. I know how this works, she said. I helped build the systems you use to predict public response. Don't forget that. He exhaled slowly. I won't. The food arrived. Conversation shifted briefly to safer ground. Memories crept in despite them, inside jokes, shared references. Moments that reminded them of how easily they had once fit. It would have been comforting if it hadn't also been dangerous. At one point, Nolan looked at her and said quietly, "I didn't know how to keep us both." Mara didn't look away. "You didn't try." The honesty hung between them, raw and unpolished. Later, as they stood to leave, Nolan reached out instinctively, then stopped himself. "We'll need to announce something soon," he said. Mara nodded. "Then let's make sure it's true enough to survive scrutiny." As she walked away, Nolan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Hope, perhaps. Or fear. Across the city, Aurora Vale watched the news cycle shift, her smile thin and calculating. She had never lost gracefully, and she had no intention of starting now. The tension was no longer theoretical, it was personal. And it was accelerating. The announcement broke 2 days later. Crest Innovations released a statement just vague enough to ignite speculation. Photos followed, Nolan and Mara stepping out of a car together, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his expression carefully unreadable. The reaction was immediate. Shock, curiosity, nostalgia. Mara Ellington, the original architect. Didn't she disappear years ago? Mara read the headlines from her apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor. Each article peeled back a layer of the past she'd never fully buried. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from former colleagues, from journalists, from people who suddenly remembered her name. One message stood out. From Aurora. "You're braver than I thought," or reckless. Mara didn't reply. That afternoon, Nolan came to her apartment unannounced. He stood in the doorway, suit immaculate, expression strained. "The board wants to accelerate." Mara crossed her arms. "That was always the plan." "No," he said. "They want commitment, timelines, they want reassurance." She studied him, really studied him, and saw it, the crack beneath the certainty. "What are you not telling me?" she asked. He hesitated. Then finally, Aurora has leverage, intellectual property claims, old agreements. Mara's breath stilled. "You said this was about perception." "It was," Nolan said. "Now it's about control." Something shifted inside her, aligning pieces she hadn't known were waiting. "You didn't bring me in just to block her," she said slowly. "You brought me in because I know where the bodies are buried." Nolan met her gaze. "You helped write the early code. You know what's clean and what is. And if I don't cooperate?" He didn't answer. Mara smiled then, not softly, not kindly. "Here, the bombshell," she said. "I didn't disappear after we broke up." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I built something," Mara continued, "quietly, ethically, and it overlaps with Crest's most sensitive systems." The color drained from his face. "You're saying—" "I'm saying I'm not leverage," she said. "I'm balance, and if this marriage is happening, it's because we're finally equals." Silence filled the room, heavy and irreversible. Nolan Crest had always believed he was the smartest person in the room. In that moment, he realized he might finally be wrong. And somehow, against all logic, that terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. As Mara turned toward the window, watching the city pulse with possibility, one question lingered quietly between them. When the truth finally comes out, Will power destroy what's left, or make room for something real? The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, quiet emails marked urgent, meetings that ended too quickly, glances that lingered just a second longer than they should have. The kind of tension that didn't scream, but pressed steadily on the chest until breathing became work. Mara felt it first. She was standing in Nolan's office again, days after the announcement, watching him argue with someone on the phone in a low, controlled voice. The city outside looked the same as it always had, but the room felt smaller now, tighter. "Yes," Nolan said. "I understand the concern. No, that won't be necessary because I said so." He ended the call and turned to her, rubbing a hand over his face. The gesture was unguarded, tired. "They're spooked," he said, "about you." Mara raised an eyebrow. That didn't take long. "They ran deeper background checks on your company." Her pulse ticked up just slightly, and they don't like what they found. Mara crossed the room and sat, folding one leg over the other. "You knew this would happen." "I knew they'd look," Nolan said. "I didn't expect them to threaten." "Threaten what?" Nolan hesitated. That was new. "A vote of no confidence, conditional. They think you're a risk." Mara stared at him. "Because I'm competent." "Because you're independent," he said quietly. "Because you don't answer to them." She laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Welcome to my world." The irony tasted bitter. For years she had been invisible. Now suddenly she was dangerous. "And Aurora?" Mara asked. Nolan's jaw tightened. "She's been talking to the board, to the press, painting this as a hostile takeover through marriage." "Is she wrong?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if trying to see where the lines were drawn now. "Is that what this is to you?" Mara stood slowly. "This was your idea." "Yes," he said, "but you're enjoying it." The words landed harder than he intended. Mara felt something inside her fracture, not loudly but decisively. "I'm surviving it," she corrected. "There's a difference." Silence stretched, thick with everything they weren't saying. That night alone in her apartment, Mara finally let the smile fall completely. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the dark screen of her phone, resisting the urge to call Theo, or Lena, or anyone who might tell her to walk away. Instead, she opened her laptop. The system she'd built years ago, quiet, clean, resilient, came to life. Lines of code she knew as well as her own thoughts. Proof of concept. Proof of independence. Proof that she could burn this whole thing down if she wanted to. Her phone buzzed. A message from Nolan. "They want you gone, before this goes any further." She closed her eyes. The next morning, the headlines exploded. Inside Crest, board divided over CEO's engagement. Is Mara ELLNGTON a liability? Aurora Vale SBEAKS out. Mara watched the interview clip in silence. Aurora, poised and immaculate, spoke with practiced concern. "I just worry about Nolan," Aurora said. "He's under a lot of pressure. Sometimes people from the past resurface for reasons that aren't entirely transparent." Mara shut the laptop. By evening, Nolan stood in her apartment again, but this time there was no ease, no shared history softening the edges, only urgency. "They're forcing a choice," he said. "Publicly distance myself from you or lose control of the company." Mara felt the room tilt. the floor suddenly unreliable beneath her feet. "So that's it." "I don't want this," Nolan said, "but if I lose Crest—" "You lose everything," she finished. He looked at her, anguish breaking through his composure. "I need time." Mara nodded slowly. "You already made your choice once." She walked past him, opened the door and held it there. When Nolan didn't move, she said quietly, "This is the part where things get worse before they get better. For both of us." He left without another word. That night alone again, Mara finally let the fear surface. Not fear of loss, she knew how to survive that, but fear of hope, of having believed, even briefly, that something between them could be rebuilt without cost. For the first time since this began, the future felt genuinely uncertain. And somewhere deep inside Crest Innovations, the systems Mara had once trusted began to fail, just enough to remind everyone how fragile power really was. The turning point came not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet realization. Nolan Crest sat alone in his office long after midnight, the city lights dimmed to a distant glow. He had replayed every scenario, every outcome, every sacrifice. The math always ended the same way: protect the company, lose the woman. It was logical. It was also wrong. He pulled up an internal report, one he hadn't looked at in years. Early architecture diagrams, decision logs, Mara's annotations still embedded in the system like a signature. She hadn't just built code. She had built values. Transparency safeguards, ethical constraints, kill switches designed to protect users, not profits. The very things the board now called inefficient were the reason Crest Innovations hadn't collapsed under its own ambition. He understood then what she'd meant. She wasn't leverage. She was the conscience he'd tried to outgrow. His phone buzzed, a message from Lena Park. "If you're thinking of choosing the easy option, don't. History won't forgive you, neither will she." Nolan stood abruptly. Across town, Mara was packing a single suitcase, not running, preparing. She had learned the difference. Whatever happened next, she would not be caught unready again. There was a knock at the door. She didn't open it immediately. "Mara," Nolan's voice came through, unsteady but unmistakably real. "Please." She opened the door. He looked different, less armored, like a man who had finally decided to stop negotiating with himself. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting," he said. "I'm releasing everything." Her breath caught. Everything. The early agreements, Aurora's claims, my mistakes. He met her eyes. "And your contribution." "That could destroy you," she said. "Yes." "And Crest." He nodded once. "Or save it." Mara searched his face looking for calculation, found none, only resolve and fear. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I finally understand the cost of choosing power over people," he said, "and I won't do it again." Something in her chest loosened, just slightly. They stood there, the past and future colliding in the narrow space between them. "Whatever happens," Nolan said, "I want it to be true." Mara closed her suitcase. "Then let's finish this," she said. As they stepped back into the city together, the night air cool and electric, one thing was certain. The story was no longer about ultimatums. It was about reckoning. And for the first time, they were facing it side by side. Part 8. The emergency board meeting, was scheduled for dawn. Not announced, not spun, just summoned. By the time the directors filed into the boardroom, tension sat heavier than the city fog outside the windows. Phones were silent. Coffee went untouched. Everyone sensed that whatever Nolan Crest had called them in for would not be incremental. Mara sat beside him, not as decoration, not as leverage, but as presence. Aurora Vale arrived last. She moved with her usual confidence, tailored perfection and a knowing smile as if this were still her stage. Her eyes flicked to Mara, sharp and assessing, then back to Nolan. "Well," Aurora said lightly, taking her seat, "this feels dramatic." Nolan didn't rise to the bait. "Let's begin," he said. The screens around the room came alive. Not projections, not summaries. Raw data. Early contracts, decision logs, archived emails, development timelines that told a story far older and more honest than any press release. Nolan spoke calmly as he walked them through it, his voice steady even as the truth grew heavier. "I built Crest Innovations," he said, "but I did not build it alone." Mara felt the room shift. This company's ethical framework, its core architecture, its safeguards, those came from Mara Ellington. She chose restraint when I chose speed. She chose people when I chose scale. Aurora leaned forward. "And you're volunteering this now because what? Guilt?" "No," Nolan said, "because control based on omission is still a lie." He gestured, and the screen changed again. Aurora's documents appeared next, the leverage she'd threatened, the intellectual property claims. Mara spoke for the first time. "They're real," she said evenly, "but incomplete. The code in question was intentionally segmented. Aurora never had access to the full system." Aurora's smile thinned. "That's your interpretation." "No," Mara said, "that's the truth, and I can prove it." She did. Piece by piece, calmly, precisely, she dismantled the narrative Aurora had been selling. Not with accusation, but with clarity. The board asked questions. Mara answered. Nolan listened. Aurora's composure cracked when the final file appeared. A signed addendum. Her signature. The room went silent. "That document," Mara said, "releases Crest from the claims you're asserting. You signed it when you believed the system had no future." Aurora stood abruptly. "This is a setup." "No," the chairwoman said quietly, "it's disclosure." The vote followed swiftly. Aurora's influence dissolved in real time. When it was over, Nolan remained CEO, but under new terms: transparent governance, shared authority, oversight that reflected the values Crest had once pretended to hold. As the board filtered out, Nolan turned to Mara. "It worked," he said. She nodded. "Truth usually does, eventually." He hesitated. "And us?" Mara studied him, not the CEO, not the man who had once left, just Nolan. "That part," she said, "doesn't get voted on." Outside, cameras waited, questions shouted, speculation already reshaping itself. Nolan took Mara's hand, not for optics, not for strategy, but because he wanted to. And this time she didn't pull away. Part 9. Months later, the city felt different. Not quieter, just steadier. Crest Innovations had changed. Slower decisions, fewer headlines, stronger foundations. Investors adjusted. The world moved on. Mara moved too. She never folded her company into Crest. Instead, the two collaborated openly, partners, not possessions. She spoke publicly now, not often but honestly. People listened. Nolan changed in ways that didn't make headlines. He left meetings early, asked better questions, let go of control when it no longer served the truth. Power still sat comfortably on his shoulders, but it no longer defined him. Their relationship didn't rush. There was no grand wedding announcement, no spectacle. Just evenings spent walking the city, conversations unfinished but unguarded, laughter returning where silence once lived. Love, rebuilt carefully, with room for failure and forgiveness. One night standing on Mara's balcony, the skyline glowing softly before them, Nolan said, "You could have destroyed me." Mara leaned into the railing. "So could you." He smiled. "Why didn't you?" She thought for a moment. "Because winning doesn't always mean someone else loses." He nodded, understanding finally complete. Below them, the city pulsed with stories just beginning. People choosing courage over comfort, truth over ease, connection over control. Mara reached for Nolan's hand. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. And if someone were to ask, watching from the outside, whether she regretted smiling and saying fine that day in his office, the answer would be simple. Sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the one that sets you free. And sometimes the bombshell isn't destruction. It's becoming exactly who you were always meant to be. Epilogue. When the city quieted. The city had a different rhythm now. Not slower, not softer, but steadier. Mara walked along the riverside promenade just as the sun began its climb, gold spilling across steel and glass like a promise. The early morning air smelled faintly of salt and wet asphalt, a contrast to the harsh city smells she'd learned to navigate years ago. But this morning, she felt no tension pressing against her lungs. She paused on the railing, hands resting lightly on cold metal, and looked at the water. The same river had been there when she was a child, when she dreamed of building things, of proving she was more than invisible. Back then, ambition had been a whisper in her heart. Now it was a song, steady, assured, and hers. She let her thoughts drift to Nolan. He had changed, of course. Not in a way that made him unfamiliar. He still carried that exacting presence, that way of entering a room and quietly bending it to focus, bending people to attention without even asking. But the edges were softened now. The hunger for control had been replaced by a measured patience, a willingness to listen even when he disagreed. She watched him in the office during the weekly team meeting sometimes, how he let people speak, how he asked questions that weren't just performance checks but genuine probes for understanding. He didn't need to dominate anymore. Mara smiled softly. She remembered the first time they had walked along this same river together after the board meeting, long before the cameras or headlines, before Aurora's calculated threats had even materialized. He had said, almost in a whisper, "You could have destroyed me." She had laughed then, dryly, without malice. "So could you?" Now, months later, the truth of that statement lingered in a new way. They could have destroyed each other easily. The city had watched, the media had speculated, and the world had expected one of them to falter. But they hadn't. And it was because they had learned something crucial, that the most important battles are never the ones fought in public. Mara turned from the railing, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. The office loomed ahead, glass reflecting morning light, but she didn't feel apprehension. She felt ready. They had survived the fire of scrutiny, the storm of power plays, and emerged, intact, strong, and unafraid. Inside, the building hummed with the quiet energy of focus and progress. Staff moved with purpose, not chaos. They were a team, not a crowd. Mara passed familiar faces, nodding briefly, nodding smiles and glances that carried unspoken gratitude. She had been underestimated for years, overlooked, a quiet genius in a world that often rewarded noise. But now there was a subtle acknowledgement of her presence, of her worth, not the kind that could be headline-grabbing or tweeted, but the kind that was real, lasting, and earned. Her office door clicked shut behind her. She inhaled, taking a moment to breathe in the faint scent of polished wood and electronics, the smell of creation. On her desk lay a small stack of reports, system health audits, new project proposals, and a handwritten note from Nalan. Meeting at 10:00. Walk along the river after. She smiled. He was making space for their personal lives in a world that had nearly consumed them both. By mid-morning, they walked together along the promenade. Nalan carried coffee for both of them, his coat draped casually over his arm. The city moved around them, cars rushing, cyclists weaving, pedestrians crossing paths, yet none of it intruded on their bubble. The sun had risen higher, reflecting on the water in long streaks of light, and Mara couldn't remember the last time she had felt so unburdened. "You know," Nalan said, sipping his coffee, "I used to think balance was impossible, that everything you want has to come at a cost." Mara turned to him, curious. "And now?" "Now I see it differently," he said. "Balance isn't about sacrifice. It's about integrity, about knowing what you're willing to fight for and what you're willing to protect." Her heart thumped lightly at the honesty in his voice. It was unguarded, vulnerable, and entirely him. She had loved him for many reasons before: ambition, brilliance, stubbornness. But now she realized she loved him for the man who could finally admit when he was wrong and choose better. They paused on a small wooden pier jutting into the river. Waves lapped gently against the supports, and seagulls circled lazily above. Mara let the moment stretch, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, the subtle breeze on her shoulders, and the steady presence of Nalan beside her. "You ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't survived it?" she asked quietly. He considered it. "Often, but it doesn't matter, we did, and here we are together." Mara's chest tightened. There had been days she doubted it, days she thought hope was a dangerous indulgence. But now, in the quiet light of morning, she knew it had been worth every risk. Back in the office, things had settled into a new rhythm. Mara and Nalan had structured Crest Innovations to be resilient not just technologically but ethically. Systems that had once been single points of failure now had safeguards, redundancies, and transparency protocols. The board was no longer afraid of her presence. They respected it. They couldn't afford to do otherwise. One afternoon, Mara found herself at the rooftop garden, reviewing a new prototype for sustainable energy modules. Nalan appeared behind her, hands in his pockets, and leaned casually against the railing. "Still building the future," he said, nodding at the panels she had been inspecting. "Someone has to," Mara replied, smiling. "And someone has to keep you from turning it all into a spectacle." He laughed softly, touché. She tilted her head, catching the sunlight in her eyes. "Do you ever regret the announcement?" He shook his head firmly. Not for a second. It forced everything into the open. It made us face what really mattered. Without it, we'd still be circling around the truth, pretending it was optional. She nodded, understanding. They had been forced into the storm, and now they were stronger because of it. "Do you think people understand what we've done?" Mara asked. "Some," Nolan admitted, "but most don't, and that's fine. We don't need validation from everyone, just each other. And the work." Mara leaned back against the railing, watching the clouds drift. She felt a quiet satisfaction, achievement, not fame, fulfillment, not approval. And in that space, she realized something else. What would you risk to protect your integrity if the world demanded compromise? She smiled at the thought, a subtle question lingering for anyone who might hear her reflection in passing. Sometimes the cost of truth was immense, but it was always worth it. As the weeks unfolded, Mara and Nolan's partnership, both personal and professional, became seamless. They learned to anticipate each other's thoughts, communicate with precision, and respect boundaries. When Mara suggested system improvements, Nolan deferred to her judgment. When Nolan had a vision for expansion, Mara offered ethical insights that tempered ambition without stifling it. Outside of work, their relationship was simple and profound. Long walks along the river, quiet dinners at home, conversations that stretched late into the night, laughter echoing off apartment walls. Mara discovered she loved the little things. The way Nolan's hair fell forward when he concentrated, the subtle way he corrected his tone when he knew he'd sounded harsh, the way he would occasionally let himself be vulnerable without pretense. And he, in turn, found a new appreciation for her resilience, brilliance, and humor, qualities he had once taken for granted. They traveled occasionally, but never far. Their adventures weren't about exotic locales or Instagram-worthy moments. They were about discovery, of ideas, of perspectives of each other. And always the river of the city pulsed below, a reminder of the life that had continued around them, relentless and unwavering, regardless of the battles they had fought. One evening, as autumn painted the city gold and amber, Mara found herself reflecting on the year. The city had tested them both, torn at their limits, and yet here they were, intact, together, and wiser. She realized she could have feared every headline, every challenge, every moment of scrutiny, but she hadn't. She had trusted herself, her judgment, and the man beside her. Nolan joined her on the balcony, bringing 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her, then took the other, standing quietly as they both watched the lights of the city flicker on. "You ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. "All the time," she replied. "It wasn't easy." "No," he said softly, "but worth it." Her eyes met his, and in that quiet gaze they both understood. The trials, the ultimatums, the threats, they had shaped them, but they had not defined them. "And if someone else faces a choice like ours," Mara asked, almost rhetorically, "would they have the courage to stand their ground?" The question lingered in the cool night air, a reflection not just for them, but for anyone who might hear it. When the world demands compromise, what would you hold sacred? Nolan smiled. They'd find their answer just like we did. Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. The city stretched endlessly before them, lights blinking like tiny affirmations. For the first time in years, she felt completely unafraid. The future was theirs, not dictated by power, threat, or history, but by choice. Because sometimes the most difficult battles were not the ones waged publicly. Sometimes The hardest victories were quietly earned, in moments of trust, resilience, and shared strength. And sometimes, the most unexpected bombshell wasn't destruction, it was freedom. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the clarity. She felt a quiet sense of hope, one that wasn't dependent on headlines or announcements. A question arose in her mind, subtle but insistent. Who else would rise if they dared to believe in themselves as we did? It was a thought she would carry forward, like a spark for the next challenge, the next innovation, the next leap. And when Nolan tightened his hand around hers, warm and steady, Mara knew she was ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, survival wasn't enough. Thriving together with integrity and love was the true victory. And for Mara and Nolan, the story was just beginning.